The whispers were like poisoned darts in the gilded ballroom. Lady Beatrice Maxwell, the woman he had publicly humiliated, was now the architect of his ruin, and a scandalous rumor had just bound their fates together in a way neither could escape. Duke Alaric Hawthorne, the untouchable Duke, felt a tremor of fear for the first time in his life. He looked across the room at the beautiful, cold woman who held his future in her hands, and knew this was no longer a game of revenge, it was a war for survival. But what he didn't know was that this forced alliance would ignite a passion far more dangerous than their hatred. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Duke Alaric Hawthorne's study was a monument to a glorious past and a testament to a decaying present. The scent of old leather and paper, once a comforting aroma of legacy, now seemed to suffocate him, thick with the dust of ages and the cloying sweetness of rot. His gaze drifted from the financial ledgers, spread across his mahogany desk, to a faint, spider-webbing water stain that marred the corner of a silk wall panel, a blemish no one else would notice but one that screamed at him. It was like the threadbare patch on the ancestral rug near the hearth, a small, ignominious secret in a room built to project unshakable power. His posture was a rigid column of aristocratic indifference as his aging steward, Mr. Gable, gestured with a trembling hand toward a column of figures that bled red ink. The man's face, etched with a lifetime of loyal service, was a mask of thinly veiled panic. "Your Grace, our creditors grow impatient." Gable's voice was low, almost a whisper, as if the very walls might have ears. The returns from the West Indies venture were less than a quarter of what was projected. The shipping investments are failing. The Northwood auction, it is our last resort. Alaric did not look up. To do so would be to acknowledge the fear in the old man's eyes, and by extension, the gnawing terror in his own gut. He was a Hawthorne. He was the Duke. Fear was a luxury afforded to other men. "Failure is not a word in the Hawthorne vocabulary, Gable," he said, his voice a low, cool baritone that betrayed none of his inner turmoil. He dipped his quill in the inkpot, the scratch of it on the paper the only sound for a long moment. "We will secure it. See to it." The dismissal was clear. Gable bowed, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a command that was easier given than executed, and retreated from the room, leaving Alaric alone with the ghosts of his dwindling fortune. The Duke's jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. Northwood. The sprawling estate was more than just land. It was the key to a loan substantial enough to keep his dukedom solvent and to mend the crumbling facade of his life before the entire world saw the rot beneath. He was a man cornered by his own name, trapped by a legacy that demanded greatness while providing him with only the dregs of it. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on his chest, and the shame of his secret financial decline was a bitter poison he swallowed daily, isolating him within the gilded cage of his own pride. That evening, the opulent London ballroom of the Marquess of Ashworth was a glittering sea of pastel silks and shimmering jewels. The air hummed with the drone of polite society chatter, a symphony of gossip, ambition, and feigned pleasantries. Alaric moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a king in his court, his handsome face a mask of charming indifference. He offered a nod here, a wry smile there, his presence commanding attention without ever needing to demand it. He was in his element, the center of this glittering universe, the untouchable Duke of Hawthorne. And then the universe tilted. A hush fell near the grand entrance, a sudden spreading silence that was more arresting than a shout. The crowd, as if pulled by an invisible tide, parted. A woman stood framed in the archway, and for a moment Alaric's breath caught in his throat. She was dressed in a gown of black silk, a stark, dramatic slash of darkness in the room of pale hues. Diamonds, cold and brilliant, glittered at her throat and ears, catching the candlelight like shards of ice. Her hair was swept up in an elegant, severe style that emphasized the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. It was a face he knew, yet didn't know. The softness was gone, the youthful blush of innocence replaced by a cool, porcelain perfection. Her beauty was no longer gentle or inviting. It was a weapon, honed and formidable. The collective gasp of the Times-Ton Times was a soft, sibilant sound, the swish of her gown against the marble floor the only other noise. It was Lady Beatrice Maxwell, the woman who had once been Lady Beatrice Vale. As she moved into the room, her eyes, dark and unreadable, swept across the assembled guests, a queen surveying her domain. Alaric felt frozen, hit by a wave of pure shock that was followed by an unwelcome, jolting current of memory. He was not just looking at a woman from his past, he was looking at a ghost he had created, a spectre remade into something terrifyingly real and powerful. For Beatrice, he knew instinctively, this was no mere arrival. It was a declaration of war. The memory ambushed him, vivid and unwelcome, pulling him back 7 years to a moonlit rose garden on a country estate. The air had been thick with the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine and the heady scent of damp earth. He had been younger then, brash and arrogant, his title still a thrilling novelty. He was flanked by his sycophantic friends, their laughter echoing in the manicured perfection of the garden as they drank his host's finest brandy. And then she had appeared, a younger, softer Beatrice, her heart shining in her wide, hopeful eyes. She had pulled him aside, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a single white rose. Her confession of love was a whisper, a fragile, beautiful thing offered up with all the earnestness of her innocent soul. "I believed. I hoped the moments we shared meant something to you, Your Grace," she had said, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. He had looked from her earnest, pleading face to his friends, who were watching with amused expressions. A wave of youthful bravado, a cruel need to perform for his audience, washed over him. He let out a short, cold laugh, a sound that made her flinch as if struck. "My dear girl," he'd scoffed, his words deliberately sharp and dismissive, each one a carefully chosen stone to build a wall between them. "You have mistaken a duke's fleeting amusement for a lifetime of devotion. A man in my position does not marry a country miss with nothing but a hopeful heart to her name. You have embarrassed yourself." The light in her eyes died, extinguished in an instant. Her face crumpled, and the devastation that washed over her was absolute, a shattering of her entire world in one brutal moment. He had felt a flicker of guilt, a brief, uncomfortable pang of conscience, but it was quickly extinguished by the bravado of his youth and the approving laughter of his friends as he turned his back on her silent, broken form. Now, in the present, recovering his composure with a force of will that was second nature, Alaric cornered her on a secluded marble terrace, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. The cool night air did little to quell the fire in his veins. He would control this. He would manage her, just as he managed everything else. He attempted to deploy his old charm, the easy, disarming smile that had served him so well for so long. "Beatrice," he began, his voice smooth as velvet, "it has been an age. Marriage was evidently kind to you." She did not startle. She stood perfectly still, her fan held like a shield across her chest. When she turned to him, her lips curved into a slight, cool smile that did not reach her eyes. "It was," she replied, her voice as crisp and cool as the diamonds she wore. "Widowhood, however, is far more profitable. I am Lady Maxwell now, a name I believe you'll come to know well." The name landed between them, a gauntlet thrown. A flash of irritation cut through him. "A new name does not change what you are." "Oh, but it does," she said, taking a slow, deliberate step closer. The scent of her perfume, something exotic and expensive, enveloped him. "That girl you scorned is gone. In her place is a woman who understands the value of things. Land, titles, reputations, they are all commodities, Your Grace." Her eyes, cold and calculating, held his. "And fortunes have a way of changing. I should know." She gave him a final, chillingly serene smile before turning and gliding back into the ballroom, leaving him standing alone on the terrace. The air suddenly felt cold, and Alaric was left stunned and deeply unsettled. Her confidence was a weapon, and he had just felt its sharp point for the very first time. Her threat was veiled, but it was as clear and unmistakable as the ice in her eyes. The game had begun, and he had the sickening feeling that he was already losing. The London auction house was a stuffy, wood-panelled chamber where the city's elite gathered to trade in land, art, and the dwindling fortunes of their peers. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and the collective anticipation of the wealthy, felt heavy and suffocating to Alaric. He stood near the back, his face a pale, resolute mask of composure, though his heart hammered against his ribs with a frantic, desperate rhythm. Lot after lot came and went, a tedious parade of porcelain and paintings, that did nothing to quell the frantic tightening in his chest. Then, finally, the auctioneer announced the last lot of the day, the Northwood estate. A palpable shift occurred in the room, a straightening of spines, a low murmur of interest. This was the main event. Alaric entered the bidding with a calm he did not feel, his voice steady as he made his first offer. The price climbed steadily, a brutal ascent that pushed him to the very precipice of his financial ruin. He saw the faces of his competitors, wealthy merchants and landed gentry, and met their bids with a stony resolve. He would not falter. He could not. His entire future, the legacy of the Hawthorne name, was balanced on this single, precarious moment. The bidding slowed. One by one, his rivals shook their heads, conceding it was down to him and a portly baronet who was sweating profusely. Alaric made his final, gut-wrenching bid, a figure that represented the absolute limit of his resources, a number that would leave him with nothing but the land itself. The baronet, looking apoplectic, threw his hands up in defeat. A wave of dizzying relief washed over Alaric. He had done it. The auctioneer raised his gavel, his voice booming through the tense silence. A magnificent bid from His Grace the Duke of Hawthorne. Do I hear any further bids for the Northwood estate? Going once. Going twice. Just as the gavel began its final decisive descent, a voice, calm and clear as a bell, cut through the thick air from the back of the room. £150,000. The words, spoken without inflection or emotion, landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp swept the room. The sum was astronomical, a full £50,000 more than Alaric's desperate final offer. It was an amount designed not merely to win, but to crush. Every head in the chamber turned, craning to see the source of the bid. It was a man Alaric did not recognize, a solicitor by his severe dress, who stood with an air of quiet, unshakable confidence. He met Alaric's stunned gaze without flinching. Alaric's blood ran cold. He knew, with a sickening certainty that twisted in his stomach, whose coin this man represented. He was financially eviscerated, unable to respond. The room watched him, a sea of curious, pitying, and triumphant faces, as he was forced to give a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. His fists were clenched at his sides, his knuckles bone, white, the only outward sign of the volcanic rage and profound public humiliation that was consuming him. Sold, the auctioneer's voice boomed, the fall of the gavel echoing like a gunshot in the silent room, to the representative of Lady Maxwell for the sum of £150,000. A wave of murmurs rippled through the chamber as all eyes turned from the solicitor to the defeated duke. Alaric felt their stares like 1,000 tiny needles, stripping away his pride, his title, his very identity, leaving him exposed and defeated. He turned on his heel and walked from the room, his back ramrod straight, his face a mask of stone, never once looking back. From a discreet alcove near the entrance, hidden behind a velvet curtain, Beatrice watched him go. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the unnatural stiffness of his stride. A surge of cold, sharp victory coursed through her, the culmination of 7 years of planning. Yet, as she watched his retreating form, the sight of his genuine, undisguised despair tainted her triumph. The victory, so long imagined, so meticulously planned, felt strangely, disappointingly hollow. In the weeks that followed, Beatrice began to weave her web. Her revenge was not a loud, brutish affair, but a subtle, masterful campaign of whispers and shadows. She moved through London society like a phantom, her influence felt everywhere, her hand rarely seen. At a ladies' afternoon tea, surrounded by the city's most influential matrons, she would guide the conversation with practiced ease. "One does worry for the Duke," she would say, her expression a perfect mask of concern, her voice laced with feigned sympathy. "Such a heavy burden, to maintain a history as grand as his. I hear his shipping ventures in the East have met with unfortunate headwinds." The words, seemingly kind, were poison, planting seeds of doubt that sprouted and grew in the fertile ground of society gossip. She was a ghost in Alaric's financial life as well. He would spend weeks courting a powerful merchant, Mr. Croft, for a partnership in a new textile mill, only to find the man suddenly cool and distant. Days later, Alaric would learn that Lady Maxwell had not only invested in a rival mill, but had offered Croft far better terms, luring him away with the promise of a venture built not on a storied name, but on a foundation of solid, modern capital. She never slandered Alaric outright. Her methods were far too elegant for that. She simply presented herself as the alternative, the future to his past. Her words to Croft, repeated back to Alaric by a mutual acquaintance, stung more than any direct insult. "The Duke is a man of impeccable taste and history," she had told the merchant over dinner at her lavish townhouse. "But my ventures, Mr. Croft, are built on the solid foundation of the future, not the crumbling stones of the past." Beatrice justified her actions in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, pacing the length of her opulent drawing room. She would replay his words in her mind, the casual cruelty in that moonlit garden, and the memory would fuel her resolve. This was justice. This was the price for his arrogance. But as she stood alone, surrounded by the immense wealth her loveless marriage had provided, a profound emptiness echoed within her. The revenge was a feast that failed to nourish. For Alaric, the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Invitations that were once guaranteed became scarce. Friends who had once sought his counsel now avoided his gaze. His pride, that great, towering fortress, became his prison. It prevented him from asking for help, from admitting the depth of his trouble. He pushed away his few remaining allies with a cool, aristocratic distance, determined to weather the storm alone, even as the water rose around him. He was becoming an island, isolated by the very name he was trying so desperately to protect. The final, most brutal blow of Beatrice's campaign came not in a ballroom or a boardroom, but on the vibrant green turf of the Royal Ascot racecourse. The air was electric with the energy of the crowd, a kaleidoscope of colorful silks and fashionable hats, the roar of the spectators punctuated by the thunder of hooves on the manicured track. Alaric, in a move of pure desperation, had placed a significant, reckless bet on his prize stallion, a magnificent creature named Starlight. The horse was a legend, known for its explosive speed, but also for its nervous, high-strung temperament. Starlight's only source of calm was his stablemate, a gentle, unassuming mare who had been by his side since he was a foal. A victory today would be a financial miracle, a lifeline to pull him from the drowning depths of his debt. He stood in the owner's box, his field glasses trained on the paddock, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He watched as the grooms tried to lead Starlight toward the track, but the horse was agitated, his eyes wide with panic, his powerful body trembling. The mare was nowhere in sight. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, began to creep up Alaric's spine. He sent a stable boy running, his own voice tight with a command that bordered on a plea. The boy returned minutes later, his face pale. "She's gone, Your Grace," the boy stammered. "Sold. An hour ago. A lady paid an exorbitant price, far more than she's worth. Had her removed from the grounds immediately." Alaric didn't need to ask the lady's name. He lowered his field glasses, his hand trembling slightly. This was different. This was not about land or business or whispers in a drawing room. This was a personal, calculated act of cruelty, an attack designed not just to wound his finances, but to break his spirit. He raised the glasses again, scanning the sea of faces in the grandstand opposite, and then he found her. She was looking directly at him, her expression perfectly, chillingly serene. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement of her checkmate. A cold, terrifying fury, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over Alaric, extinguishing the last embers of his hope. He watched as his magnificent horse, agitated and alone, ran erratically, fighting the jockey, his powerful stride broken and chaotic. Starlight finished last. Alaric lowered his glasses, the roar of the crowd fading to a dull hum in his ears. He looked across the track at Beatrice, at the beautiful, implacable woman who was dismantling his world, piece by painful piece. He understood now. She didn't just want to ruin him, she wanted to break him. The fight was no longer about money or pride, it was about survival. The attack on his legacy was the one blow Alaric had not anticipated. Beatrice's campaign had been brutally effective, dismantling his finances with the precision of a surgeon. But this next move was the work of a butcher. It was aimed not at his wallet, but at his heart, at the very soul of his identity. The Royal Antiquarian and Preservation Society was a hallowed institution, its members a collection of wizened academics and wealthy patrons dedicated to preserving the nation's history. They met in a dusty, book-lined hall where the air smelled of decaying paper and intellectual fervor. Alaric stood before them, his voice resonating with a passion that surprised even himself, pleading for a grant to restore the St. Giles Chapel on his estate. It was a crumbling Norman structure, its stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, but it was the first thing a Hawthorne had ever built on English soil. It was more than a building, it was a testament to his lineage, a sacred link to the first Duke who had laid its foundation. The project was of no financial benefit, it was a matter of honor, a desperate attempt to hold on to something real and meaningful while the rest of his world turned to dust. He finished his plea, the raw emotion in his voice hanging in the silent, stuffy air. He felt he had moved them. He saw nods of sympathy from several of the older members. Then, a chair scraped against the floorboards. Lady Beatrice Maxwell rose to her feet. She had, Alaric had learned with a jolt of dread only moments before the meeting began, recently become the Society's most generous new patron, her donation eclipsing the yearly contributions of half the members present. All eyes turned to her as she took the floor, her poise devastating, her black mourning dress lending her an air of somber authority. "Your Grace speaks with great passion," she began, her voice a calm melodic counterpoint to his own raw appeal. "And his desire to honor his ancestors is, of course, commendable." She paused, letting her words settle. "But I must ask the esteemed members of this society to consider our greater purpose. Are we here to serve the lineage of one family or the history of one nation? The sum requested for this chapel, a private monument on private land, could fund the restoration of 3 public almshouses in London, or perhaps the preservation of the coastal fort in Dover, which protected our shores for generations of Englishmen, not just one family." She turned her gaze on Alaric, her eyes holding not malice, but a chillingly effective logic. "Gentlemen, our duty is to preserve history that serves the people, not to polish the tarnished relics of a single family's pride." It was a masterstroke of rhetoric, framing his desperate plea for legacy as an act of selfish arrogance. The committee, swayed by her impeccable logic and, no doubt, the memory of her very recent and very large donation, deliberated for less than 5 minutes. The grant was denied. The blow was so profound, so personal, that Alaric felt it as a physical impact, a hollowing out of his chest. He confronted her in the antechamber as she was pulling on her gloves, the fury and pain making his voice roar. "Was my fortune not enough?" he demanded, his control shattering. "Was my name, my reputation, not enough? Must you also erase my history?" For the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than icy control in her eyes. It was not pity, but something closer to remorse, a brief, unguarded glimpse of the woman she had been before he had broken her. She saw that she had not just outmaneuvered him, she had genuinely wounded him, striking at a place far deeper than his pride. The realization seemed to unsettle her, and she looked away, unable to meet the raw agony in his gaze. "Some relics," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, "are meant to crumble, Your Grace." She then swept past him, leaving him alone with the ashes of his heritage. The invitation to Lord and Lady Danbury's annual autumn house party was a royal command in all but name. To refuse was to commit social suicide. And so, both Alaric and Beatrice found themselves in attendance, trapped for 3 days on a sprawling, magnificent estate in the countryside, forced to interact with a veneer of civility under the 1,000 watchful eyes of the Times ton asterisk. The tension between them was a palpable, crackling thing, a third guest in every room they occupied. Other guests noticed, of course. They whispered behind their fans and over their wine glasses, their eyes darting between the ruined Duke and the formidable widow who had orchestrated his downfall. The air was thick with unspoken speculation, making every polite nod, every forced smile, an excruciating performance. They studiously avoided one another, moving in opposite orbits through the endless series of planned activities, from morning rides to afternoon teas to evening card games. On the second day, during a lull in the festivities, Alaric found the stifling atmosphere of the great house unbearable. He slipped out of a side door and into the gardens, seeking a moment of solitude. He walked for nearly an hour, his feet carrying him aimlessly along winding gravel paths, past manicured hedges and ornate fountains, until he reached a more remote, wilder part of the estate. The air here was cooler, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a welcome respite from the cloying perfumes of the ballroom. He was not alone for long. He saw a figure in the distance, standing near a grove of ancient oak trees. It was Beatrice. She, too, had evidently sought to escape the suffocating confines of the party. They saw each other at the same moment, and a tense, awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the rising wind. They stood there for a long moment, two opposing generals meeting on a field of truce, neither willing to retreat, neither knowing what to say. Then the sky began to change. The pale afternoon sun vanished, swallowed by a bank of bruised purple clouds that rolled in from the west with an unnatural speed. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a strange electric energy. A distant rumble of thunder echoed across the hills, a low growl that grew steadily closer. The smell of petrichor, that unique, earthy scent of rain on dry soil, rose from the ground. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dry leaves like scattered pebbles. Within moments, the heavens opened, and a sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted, unleashing a torrential downpour. Guests closer to the house made a frantic rush for cover. Their laughter and shrieks carried on the wind, but Alaric and Beatrice were too far out, caught in the deluge, the main house a distant, impossible goal. Through the sheeting rain, Alaric spotted it, a small forgotten stone folly half, hidden by overgrown ivy on a nearby rise. It was little more than a circular ruin of columns and a domed roof, but it was shelter. He grabbed Beatrice's arm, the shock of the contact surprising them both, and pulled her toward it. They scrambled up the slick, grassy slope and stumbled inside just as a brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. They were trapped. The folly was tiny, barely large enough for two people to stand without touching. It was cramped and dusty, smelling of damp earth, wet stone, and old rain. The storm raged outside, a wild, chaotic symphony of wind and water, isolating them completely from the rest of the world. The awkward silence inside the small structure was broken only by the drumming of rain on the stone roof and the chattering of Beatrice's teeth. She was soaked through, her elegant walking dress clinging to her, her shoulders trembling uncontrollably from the sudden biting chill. Without a word, Alaric shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the fabric dark and damp with rain, and draped it over her shoulders. It was a simple, unthinking gesture, an instinctual act of kindness that had nothing to do with their war, their history, or the roles they played for society. It was merely a man seeing a woman who was cold. The simple, unexpected act of chivalry seemed to break the spell of their animosity. The heavy coat enveloped her, its warmth and weight a startling comfort, smelling faintly of him, of rain and of wool. She pulled it tighter around herself, her trembling slowly subsiding. "You will be cold, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet, stripped of its usual icy edge. She did not look at him, staring instead out at the blurred grey curtain of rain that surrounded them. Alaric stood with his back against a cold stone column, his own shirt now damp and clinging to his skin. He followed her gaze, watching the storm. "I have weathered worse storms," he replied, his voice low. A wry, humorless smile touched his lips. "We seem to have a habit of finding ourselves in gardens during inclement weather." The shared memory, now stripped of its audience and its cruelty, hung in the air between them. Beatrice's shoulders tensed beneath his coat. "This is quite different from the last time," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. And it was. The forced proximity, the shared vulnerability, and the small, uncalculated act of kindness had stripped away their public personas, their carefully constructed armor of enmity. In the cramped, dusty confines of the forgotten folly, they were not the Duke of Hawthorne and Lady Maxwell, the ruined man and his vengeful nemesis. For a fleeting, confusing moment, they were just Alaric and Beatrice, a man and a woman bound by a painful history, trapped together in a storm. A fragile, unspoken truce began to form in the charged air of the tiny space, confusing them both with the faint, treacherous spark of their old, long, buried connection. The hatred that had defined them for so long was momentarily washed away by the rain, replaced by something far more complicated and unsettling. The truce forged in the storm-lashed folly was a fragile, temporary thing. As the rain subsided and they made their way back to the grand house through the dripping, glistening gardens, The silence between them was no longer one of animosity, but of profound, unnerving awkwardness. They parted at the door with a stiff, formal nod, each retreating to their respective chambers to change out of their damp clothes. The warmth of his coat, a phantom weight on Beatrice's shoulders, the scent of her perfume, a ghost in Alaric's senses. When they re-emerged for the grand finale ball that evening, the fragile peace had been replaced by a carefully reconstructed wall of polite indifference. The ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle of light and sound, the orchestra playing a lively waltz, the air shimmering with the glow of 1,000 candles. But the atmosphere was about to be shattered by a single, poisonous whisper. Lord Harrington, a man whose ambition far outstripped his means, watched them from across the room. His resentment for Alaric was a long, simmering thing, a bitter envy of a title and lineage he could never possess. His desire for Beatrice, or rather, for the vast Maxwell fortune, was a more recent and far more urgent obsession. He had seen them earlier, emerging from the overgrown path that led from the old folly, their hair still damp from the storm, their expressions guarded. It was nothing, and yet it was everything he needed. He saw his opportunity, a way to strike at both his rivals with a single, aimed stone. He sought out the company of Mr. Finch, a man whose quill was sharper than any dueling sword, the notorious gossip columnist whose weekly society papers were devoured with a mixture of terror and delight by the Times ton asterisk. Harrington found him near the champagne fountain, his eyes darting about the room, constantly searching for his next victim. Feigning a deep, troubled concern, Harrington pulled the columnist aside. "A dreadful business," Harrington began, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "One hesitates to speak of it, but my conscience insists." He sighed, a masterful performance of reluctance. "I was taking the air after the storm, and I saw them. The Duke and Lady Maxwell, emerging from that dreadful old ruin in the gardens. Their clothes were, quite disheveled. One can hardly blame them, I suppose." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A desperate duke, a lonely widow, passions inflamed by the storm. It seems they have found a most convenient consolation in each other's arms. A pity they were so careless." Finch's eyes lit up with a vulture's gleam. The story was perfect. The fallen duke and the vengeful widow, locked not in a battle of wits, but in a secret, illicit embrace. It was scandalous, it was delicious, and it would sell thousands of papers. He needed no further encouragement. The rumor spread through the ballroom with the breathtaking speed of a forest fire. It was a whisper passed from behind a fan, a knowing glance exchanged over the rim of a wine glass, a hushed comment that turned heads and drew stares. At first, it was just a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the social barometric pressure that both Alaric and Beatrice were acutely attuned to. A conversation that died abruptly when Beatrice approached, a group of men who fell silent and smirked as Alaric passed. Then, the whispers grew bolder, the stares more pointed. Beatrice felt the familiar, sickening sting of public shame, the very humiliation she had fled 7 years ago, returning with a vengeance. Her fortune, her title, her carefully constructed armor of icy control, it was all rendered useless against the insidious power of gossip. She felt naked, exposed, the whispers like 1,000 tiny cuts against her skin. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic, trapped bird. Across the room, Alaric felt a different emotion. It was a cold, protective rage that coiled in his gut, a fury so intense it was almost dizzying. It was not just for his own name, which had already been dragged through the mud of financial ruin, but for hers. He saw the look on her face, the flicker of raw panic in her eyes, before she masked it with her usual serene composure, and something primal and possessive surged within him. Their individual anger, his for the injustice and hers for the shame, began to merge, twisting together into a shared, suffocating sense of being under siege. They were trapped, and the walls were closing in. Alaric moved through the crowd, his progress a deliberate, unstoppable force. The whispers died in his wake, the smirking faces turning away as he approached. He found Beatrice standing alone on a small, deserted balcony, the cool night air a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. She was gripping the cold stone balustrade, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the dark, unseeing garden below. The anger that had defined their every interaction for weeks was gone, incinerated by the heat of the scandal. In its place was a grim, shared understanding. They were both trapped in the same web, caught by a predator they had not seen coming. He came to stand beside her, not speaking for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with the weight of their new reality. He could see the genuine fear in her eyes when she finally turned to look at him, a vulnerability she had never allowed him to witness before. It disarmed him completely, his own fury softening into a raw, unwavering determination. "He has ruined me," she said, her voice tight and brittle, stripped of all its power and control. It was the quiet, desperate admission of a woman who had built an empire of revenge, only to see it threatened by the one weapon she could not fight: public opinion. "This is the one thing my fortune cannot fix, the one stain it cannot wash away." Alaric looked at her, at the proud, formidable woman who had brought him to his knees, now looking as lost and broken as she had in that garden 7 years ago. The irony was not lost on him, but it brought him no satisfaction. All he felt was a fierce, unyielding resolve. "No," he said, his voice low and intense, a blade in the quiet night. He waited until she met his gaze, holding it with the force of his will. "He has times tried, times to ruin, times us asterisk, and we are not going to let him succeed." The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with a significance that transcended their bitter history. Asterisk us asterisk. It was a declaration, a realignment of the universe. It was no longer Alaric versus Beatrice. It was Alaric and Beatrice versus the world. For the first time they were a unit, their personal war suddenly, shockingly, overshadowed by a more immediate and dangerous threat. A bond had been forged between them, not of affection, but of mutual desperation. They were no longer enemies, they were allies. "The library," Alaric said, his voice a low command. "Now." Beatrice simply nodded, her mind still reeling from the impact of that single transformative word. They slipped away from the balcony, moving through the throng of guests like ghosts, their shared purpose a cloak of invisibility. The Danburys' library was a sanctuary of silence, a vast, two-story room lined from floor to ceiling, with books that smelled of leather and time. A fire crackled in the grand stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was a room built for quiet contemplation, and now for desperate strategy. Beatrice began to pace before the fire, her silk gown whispering against the thick Persian rug, her movements agitated, like a caged panther. She felt trapped, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, all her wealth, all her power, all her meticulous planning, and she had been brought low by a simple, malicious lie. "They will believe him," she said, her voice tight with a panic she could no longer suppress. "They will all believe him. I will be a pariah, the lonely, wanton widow who seduced a desperate duke. It is a narrative they will relish." Alaric did not pace. He stood by the massive fireplace, one arm resting on the carved oak mantelpiece, his expression grim as he stared into the flames. He was thinking, his mind working with a cold, ruthless clarity he had not felt in months. He saw the trap Harrington had laid for them, a snare of public opinion that would only tighten with every denial. "Of course they will believe him," he said, his voice calm and measured, cutting through her panic. "Denying it will only fuel the flames. We will look guilty, our protests nothing more than the desperate lies of two people caught in a sordid affair. We cannot fight the story, Beatrice." He turned from the fire to face her, his eyes dark and intense in the flickering light. He saw the path forward, a narrow, treacherous road that was, nonetheless, the only way out. It was a plan born of pure desperation, a gamble so audacious it bordered on madness. "We cannot deny it," he repeated, his voice dropping lower. "So we will give them a different story, a better one. We will not just accept the narrative, we will seize it. We will reshape it into something of our own making." Beatrice stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What are you talking about? What story could possibly be better than the one Harrington is peddling?" Alaric took a step toward her, his presence filling the space between them. "We will announce our engagement." The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a still pond. Beatrice stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, her mind refusing to process the sheer insanity of the proposal. "You cannot be serious," she finally managed to say, her voice a choked whisper. "That is madness. To tie myself to you, the man I set out to destroy. The world would laugh at us. Let them laugh, Alaric countered, his gaze unwavering. Their laughter will be short-lived. Think, Beatrice. Use that brilliant, calculating mind of yours. An engagement legitimizes everything. Our being seen together, the time and the folly, all of it. It is no longer a sordid, secret rendezvous. It is the courtship of a future Duke and Duchess. It turns Harrington's poison into a celebratory toast. It makes him look like a fool, a malicious gossip who tried to smear a loving couple and failed. He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes and pressed his advantage. It is the only logical move, a temporary alliance, nothing more. We present a united front. We weather this storm together, and once Harrington is dealt with and the gossip dies down, we quietly and amicably end it. No one need ever know the truth. He stood before her, offering not a declaration of love, but a devil's bargain, a truce, a partnership forged in the fires of mutual ruin. "What say you, Lady Maxwell?" he asked, his voice a low, compelling murmur. "A truce? To defeat a common enemy?" Beatrice looked at him, at the man who had been the sole focus of her anger and her pain for 7 long years. He was offering her a lifeline, but it was attached to the very anchor she had been trying to sink. It was a desperate, terrifying gamble. To agree would be to place her trust, her reputation, and her future in the hands of the one man she had sworn to destroy. But as she looked into his determined eyes, she saw not the arrogant boy from the garden, but a man as cornered and as desperate as she was. And in his mad plan, she saw the cold, ruthless logic that had guided her own campaign against him. It was a move she would have made herself. A slow nod was her only answer. The decision was made. The tension between them shifted again, the last vestiges of their old hatred burning away, replaced by the terrifying, electric uncertainty of their new, unholy alliance. Their public debut as a blissfully engaged couple took place in the royal box at the Covent Garden Opera. It was the perfect stage for their charade. From their gilded perch, they were visible to the whole of London society, a living tableau of scandalous rumour transformed into romantic triumph. Alaric played his part with a chilling perfection that Beatrice found both impressive and infuriating. He was the picture of the devoted fiancé, his hand resting with a confident, possessive warmth on the small of her back, the gesture sending a shiver through the silk of her gown that had nothing to do with the theatre's draft. When he leaned in to whisper a comment about the performance, his breath warm against her ear, the watching eyes below saw only intimacy. They did not hear his low, clipped murmur, "You are leaning away from me, Beatrice." A loving fiancée does not recoil from her future husband's touch. She corrected her posture instantly, turning to him with a smile of feigned adoration that felt like a grimace. "My apologies, Your Grace," she whispered back, her voice sweet as honey, her eyes glittering with a cold fire he was beginning to know well. "I am still unaccustomed to such public displays of, what shall we call it, ownership." They were flawless, riding side by side in Hyde Park the next afternoon, he on a magnificent black stallion and she on a spirited white mare. They looked for all the world like a legendary couple from a romantic poem. He would reach over and gently adjust a stray lock of her hair, a gesture of casual tenderness that sent a fresh wave of whispers through the watching promenaders. In the quiet moments of the carriage ride home, however, when the performance ended and the curtain of privacy fell, a heavy, charged silence would descend. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, with the grating reality of their forced proximity. It was in these quiet moments that the facade began to crack, not for the public, but for them. Through the exhausting charade, they began to see past the roles they had assigned each other. During a tedious dinner party at her own townhouse, where Alaric was forced to play the host beside her, she found herself drawn into a conversation about her late husband's shipping business. She spoke of trade routes and profit margins with a sharp, incisive intelligence that Alaric had only ever experienced as a weapon used against him. Now, hearing her discuss it with a passion devoid of vengeful intent, he found himself listening with a grudging and then genuine admiration. He saw not the Nemesis, but a brilliant woman of commerce. Later that evening, when a pompous lord told a clumsy, unfunny joke at her expense, Beatrice let out a small, genuine laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement at the man's absurdity. The sound was so unexpected, so different from her usual cool, controlled smiles that it struck Alaric with the force of a physical blow. It was a sound from 7 years ago, a ghost of the girl in the garden, and it lit up her entire face, erasing the cold mask of Lady Maxwell and revealing, for just an instant, the Beatrice he had once known. The line between the performance and the reality was beginning to blur, the forced intimacy of their alliance acting as a crucible, stripping away their armor and exposing the raw, vulnerable people beneath. The tension was no longer just about their shared danger. It was becoming a confusing, undeniable, and deeply treacherous attraction. They returned late one evening from a grueling ball at the Russian embassy, the exhaustion of their performance leaving them both raw and unguarded. The footman closed the door to Beatrice's London home behind them, plunging the grand foyer into a quiet stillness, broken only by the ticking of a tall case clock. Without a word, they moved into the drawing room, where a low fire still crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. Beatrice sank into a velvet armchair, pulling off her long silk gloves with weary fingers. Alaric went to stand by the fire, staring down into the embers, the ducal mask of indifference finally gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness that mirrored her own. The silence stretched, no longer awkward or hostile, but heavy with the weight of everything they were pretending to be, and everything they actually were. Beatrice looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window, at the rigid set of his shoulders, and the question that had been the driving force of her life for 7 years, the question that had fueled her revenge and haunted her dreams, finally broke free. It was not an accusation, not a shot in their ongoing war, but a quiet, desperate plea for understanding. "I have to know," she said, her voice soft, devoid of its usual iciness. She did not look at him, but continued to stare into the fire, as if the answer might be found in the dancing flames. "And I want the truth. That day in the garden, why? Why were you so cruel?" The question hung in the air, stripped of all pretense, all anger, all performance. It was the sound of a wound that had never healed, finally being exposed to the air. Alaric did not move for a long moment. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, each second a hammer blow against the silence. He had replayed that moment in his mind 1,000 times, the shame of it a constant, dull ache in his soul. He had told himself he had no choice, that his cruelty was a necessity, but hearing the quiet, genuine pain in her voice now, after all these years, stripped away his justifications and left him with only the ugly, unvarnished truth of his own cowardice. He finally turned from the fire to face her. In the soft, forgiving light of the flames, his face was a landscape of profound, weary regret. The arrogant Duke was gone, replaced by a man haunted by his own past. "Because I was a coward," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had suppressed for years. "I was a fraud, and I was terrified." He took a step closer, not to intimidate, but to be seen, to be understood. "My father had died only a month before. He left behind a title, a crumbling estate, and a secret mountain of debt so vast I thought it would swallow me whole. The dukedom was bankrupt. I was 22 years old, and I was drowning. Every day I woke up feeling like an imposter, a boy playing a duke's part, waiting for the entire world to discover that the great house of Hawthorne was nothing but a hollow shell." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to see the scared, desperate boy he had been. "And then there was you. You were so full of light, so full of genuine, honest feeling. You looked at me as if I were everything I was pretending to be, and I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear the thought of pulling you down with me, of shackling you to my inevitable ruin, of watching that light in your eyes die when you discovered the truth." His voice broke, the confession a torrent of long-buried pain. "So I did the only thing my terrified, foolish mind could think of. I pushed you away. I used cruelty as a shield, for both of us. I thought if I could make you hate me, you would be safe from me." It was a twisted, monstrous act of mercy, a boy's clumsy, brutal attempt to protect the one good, pure thing in his life. He took a final, hesitant step until he was standing directly before her chair. "It was cowardly. It was unforgivable. But it was never because I didn't feel anything for you, Beatrice." He knelt before her, taking her hands in his gaze locking with hers. "It was because I felt everything." The confession shattered the very foundation of Beatrice's world. The anger she had nurtured for 7 years, the righteous fury that had been her constant companion, her shield and her sword, simply evaporated. It was like a dam breaking, the force of her hatred vanishing in a sudden, shocking wave of understanding. The man she had devoted her life to destroying was not a monster. He was a scared boy who had been trying, in his own broken and terrible way, to protect her. The intricate palace of her revenge, built stone by painful stone, crumbled to dust around her, leaving her exposed and reeling in the ruins. All that was left was the shocking, undeniable truth, and the man kneeling before her, his heart as broken as her own. The confession hung between them in the silent room, a raw, open wound. The air was thick with the ghosts of 7 wasted years, with the echoes of unspoken emotions and the bitter taste of a revenge that had been built on a lie. Beatrice looked down at Alaric, at his hands holding hers, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and the last of her defenses crumbled. The years of anger, the meticulously planned ruin, the cold satisfaction, it all dissolved, replaced by a dizzying, overwhelming wave of shock, empathy, and a dawning, terrifying tenderness. Slowly, she pulled her hands from his and rose from the chair. He remained kneeling, his head bowed, as if awaiting a sentence. She took a single, hesitant step toward him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a deep, aching sorrow for the boy he had been and the woman she had become. The space between them crackled with an unbearable tension, a mixture of pain and longing, of regret and a shocking, undeniable hope. The simmering passion they had both been fighting, the dangerous current that had been running beneath the surface of their charade, finally ignited. He looked up at her as she stood over him, and in her eyes he saw not the icy fury of Lady Maxwell, but the dawning forgiveness of Beatrice. It was all the invitation he needed. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, crossing the small space between them in 2 long strides. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, and met her gaze. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the 2 of them in the flickering firelight, suspended in a moment that had been 7 years in the making. Then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a release of 7 years of unspoken words, of buried feelings, of shared pain and simmering desire. It was the raw, cathartic expression of everything that had been twisted and broken between them. Her hands came up to clutch at his shoulders, pulling him closer, answering his desperation with her own. The kiss deepened, a frantic, searching exploration that was both a question and an answer, a battle and a surrender. It was the taste of regret and the promise of redemption, the bitterness of the past and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a future. The fire in the hearth seemed to flare, mirroring the inferno that had erupted between them. The kiss was a point of no return, an act that irrevocably shattered the last vestiges of their enmity and their alliance of convenience. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, they simply stared at each other, the truth of what had just happened reflected in their wide, dazed eyes. Without another word, he swept her into his arms and carried her from the drawing room, up the grand staircase, and into the quiet sanctuary of her bedroom. The act was cathartic, transformative, a final, absolute surrender to the feelings they had both denied for so long. Their alliance was no longer fake in any sense. They had found each other through the wreckage of their past, but their future was still a fragile thing, built on a public lie, with an enemy who still remained at large, waiting in the shadows. Lord Harrington, incandescent with a fury born of public humiliation, refused to accept defeat. The engagement announcement had not only neutralized his scandal, but had turned him into a laughingstock, a malicious gossip foiled by a grand romance. His desperation, fueled by mounting gambling debts and a festering hatred for Alaric's unearned privilege, drove him to play his final, most venomous card. He sought an audience with the Lord Chancellor himself, presenting his case not in the shadowy corners of a ballroom, but in the hallowed, wood-paneled office that served as the kingdom's legal heart. He laid a small, leather-bound portfolio on the Chancellor's imposing desk. Inside were expertly forged letters, their paper artificially aged, the ink faded, the handwriting a masterful imitation of the late Duke of Hawthorne's script. They were supplemented with falsified shipping manifests and bank ledgers, a web of intricate lies that, when woven together, told a damning story that Alaric's father had been a traitor, selling state secrets to the French during the height of the war. The evidence was compelling, meticulously crafted to prey on old fears and suspicions. The Lord Chancellor, a man for whom duty outweighed all else, examined the documents with a grim expression. The forgeries were good enough, the accusations serious enough, that he had no choice. A formal inquiry was launched, a process that could strip Alaric not only of his title and lands, but of his family's very name and honor, branding them traitors for all time. The news struck Alaric like a physical blow, far harder than the loss of his fortune or the attacks on his reputation. This was an assault on his father's grave, a desecration of his memory. He felt a cold, terrifying dread, not for his own future, but for the legacy he was sworn to protect. He had expected Beatrice to leave. Their bargain was a sham, their passion a complication. This new threat was an abyss, and he could not ask her to fall into it with him. He found her in the study, the official notice from the Chancellor's office held loosely in his hand. "You should go," he said, his voice hollow. "This has gone far beyond a society scandal. Harrington is trying to erase my family from history. I release you from our arrangement. No one will blame you for abandoning a traitor's son." Beatrice looked from the letter in his hand to the bleak despair in his eyes. She, who had once dreamed of his complete and utter ruin, now found the prospect of his annihilation unbearable. The thought of him facing this alone, of Harrington winning this final vile victory, ignited a fire of protective fury within her. She walked over to him, took the letter from his unresisting fingers, and read it. Her expression hardened, not with fear, but with a cold, diamond, hard resolve. "You foolish, proud man," she said, her voice low and fierce.